On February 28, 1993, at approximately 10 a.m. Central Time, federal agents approached a religious compound near Waco, Texas, carrying properly executed warrants and following established tactical protocols. Radio communications functioned normally. Command hierarchies operated as trained. Intelligence assessments had been processed through standard channels. Equipment functioned within specifications. The operation represented decades of refined law enforcement methodology applied to a situation that appeared to fit known parameters. What followed was not the result of equipment malfunction or procedural deviation. The system performed exactly as its designers intended. Agents executed their training. Commanders made decisions based on available information processed through established analytical frameworks. Communication protocols ensured coordination between multiple agencies. Every participant acted within their defined role according to doctrine that had been validated through years of successful operations. Yet embedded within this operational architecture were assumptions about information interpretation, threat dynamics, and tactical escalation that had never been tested against the specific conditions present at Mount Carmel. The gap between design system behavior and actual system requirements would prove unbridgeable not through any single point of failure, but through the accumulated logic of how information was gathered, processed, and acted upon. The multi-agency coordination framework that governed the branch Davidian operation represented the culmination of decades of federal law enforcement evolution. This framework emerged from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's establishment of specialized tactical units in the 1960s, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms development of complex investigations capabilities, and the Department of Defense's Post-Posse Comitatus Act support protocols. Each component had been refined through countless operations, creating a sophisticated system for deploying federal resources against identified threats. The coordination protocol operated on fundamental assumptions about the nature of criminal activity and the appropriate governmental response. Federal warrants were served through a standardized process that assumed suspects would either surrender immediately or offer resistance that could be overcome through superior tactical preparation and execution. The system presumed that criminal organizations, regardless of their ideological motivations, would respond to federal authority according to predictable patterns established through decades of law enforcement experience. Intelligence gathering followed established methodologies designed to categorize threats according to known classifications. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms had developed sophisticated frameworks for investigating firearms violations, which formed the primary legal basis for the Mount Carmel operation. These frameworks assumed that evidence of firearms law violations could be gathered through conventional investigative techniques: surveillance, informants, purchase records, and physical observation. The system was designed to build cases that could withstand judicial scrutiny while providing tactical teams with actionable intelligence about suspect capabilities and intentions. The multi-agency coordination framework contained explicit protocols for integrating military support when operations exceeded standard law enforcement capabilities. The Department of Defense had established procedures for providing assistance to civilian law enforcement agencies under specific circumstances, particularly when drug-related activity was suspected. These protocols had been refined through the 1980s and early 1990s as federal agencies developed sophisticated approaches to complex criminal organizations. Military support integration represented a significant force multiplier that allowed federal agencies to conduct operations far beyond their organic capabilities. The Texas National Guard and Joint Task Force 6 provided specialized equipment, training, and reconnaissance capabilities that civilian agencies could not match. This support system assumed that military assets could be seamlessly integrated into law enforcement operations without fundamentally altering the operational logic or tactical objectives. The cost-benefit analysis embedded within the coordination framework presumed that federal resources deployed efficiently would achieve tactical objectives with minimal risk to personnel and maximum probability of successful warrant execution. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms had requested military support specifically because the Mount Carmel operation exceeded standard parameters for personnel requirements, specialized equipment needs, and tactical complexity. The framework provided mechanisms for scaling federal response to match assessed threat levels. However, the coordination framework contains systematic assumptions about the relationship between tactical preparation and operational success that had never been tested against religious communities, with extensive compound fortifications and ideological commitment to armed resistance. Standard law enforcement methodology presumed that superior tactical preparation would translate directly into operational control, allowing federal agents to dictate the terms of engagement and maintain initiative throughout the operation. The intelligence assessment process operated according to established threat categorization matrices that assumed criminal organizations could be understood through conventional analytical frameworks. Religious communities presented unique challenges that did not map cleanly onto existing threat models. The branch Davidians represented a hybrid category that combined elements of religious organization, communal living arrangement, firearms collection, and ideological commitment to self-defense against perceived governmental persecution. Standard intelligence gathering techniques had provided federal agencies with detailed information about weapons purchases, building modifications, and community membership. This information was processed through analytical frameworks designed for conventional criminal organizations, producing threat assessments that emphasize tactical challenges while underestimating ideological factors that could influence community response to federal intervention. The coordination framework assumed that accurate intelligence could be converted into effective tactical planning through established methodologies. Tactical planners operated with detailed compound layouts, personnel counts, weapons inventories, and behavioral assessments. This information supported the development of operational plans that allocated federal resources according to assessed requirements for successful warrant execution. Yet the framework contained no mechanisms for questioning fundamental assumptions about the relationship between tactical superiority and operational success when dealing with ideologically motivated communities prepared for extended resistance. The system was optimized for operations where tactical advantages could be converted into immediate compliance, not for scenarios where tactical action might catalyze prolonged confrontation. The legal framework governing multi-agency operations assumed that federal warrants provided sufficient legal authority to override local concerns and community autonomy. The coordination system operated according to established precedents where federal authority superseded local considerations when criminal activity reached federal thresholds. This legal framework had been tested extensively in drug enforcement operations, organized crime investigations, and domestic terrorism cases. Federal agencies operated with confidence that their legal authorities were adequate to justify whatever tactical actions proved necessary for warrant execution. The legal framework provided explicit authorization for military support, surveillance operations, and tactical interventions that exceeded normal law enforcement parameters. These authorities had been refined through decades of judicial review and legislative oversight, creating robust legal foundations for complex operations. However, the legal framework assumed that communities subject to federal intervention would recognize federal authority as legitimate, even when disagreeing with specific actions. The system presumed that legal compliance could be enforced through tactical superiority when voluntary compliance proved insufficient. This assumption had never been tested against religious communities with theological justifications for resisting federal authority as illegitimate governmental persecution. The resource allocation logic embedded within the coordination framework operated according to efficiency principles that assumed tactical problems could be solved through appropriate resource deployment. Military assistance provided specialized capabilities that civilian agencies lacked, including aerial reconnaissance, armored vehicles, communications equipment, and training facilities. These resources were allocated according to assessed tactical requirements, with costs justified by operational necessity. The framework contained mechanisms for cost-sharing between agencies and reimbursing military organizations for support provided. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Federal Bureau of Investigation operated with approved budgets for complex operations, including provisions for military support when civilian capabilities proved insufficient. This financial architecture assumed that operational costs could be controlled through efficient resource utilization and successful tactical execution. cost-benefit calculations presumed that federal resources deployed efficiently would achieve objectives with minimal expenditure and maximum operational success. The system was designed to scale resource deployment to match assessed threat levels, providing tactical advantages sufficient to ensure rapid warrant execution without excessive costs or prolonged operations. The coordination framework assumed that appropriate resource allocation would prevent operations from exceeding planned parameters. The command structure embedded within the multi-agency coordination framework assumed that tactical authority could be exercised effectively across organizational boundaries through established protocols. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms maintained operational command for warrant execution while coordinating with military support elements according to defined roles and responsibilities. Command relationships had been clarified through written agreements that specified decision-making authority and operational boundaries. The framework presumed that complex operations could be managed through hierarchical command structures that maintained clear authority relationships while enabling tactical flexibility. Military support operated under civilian law enforcement command, with specialized capabilities integrated into overall operational plans. This command architecture had proven effective in previous operations where military assets supported civilian law enforcement objectives. Yet the command structure contained assumptions about the relationship between tactical planning and operational control that presumed environmental factors would remain within predictable parameters. The system was optimized for operations where initial tactical advantages could be maintained throughout the engagement, allowing commanders to execute predetermined plans without fundamental operational adjustments. The coordination framework represented a sophisticated system for deploying federal resources against identified threats, incorporating decades of operational experience and institutional learning. However, the system contained embedded assumptions about suspect behavior, environmental control, and tactical effectiveness that had never been validated against religious communities, with extensive defensive preparations and ideological commitment to armed resistance. These assumptions would prove systematically incompatible with the conditions present at Mount Carmel, creating operational dynamics that the framework was not designed to manage. The tactical doctrine that shaped federal law enforcement response to the Mount Carmel situation emerged from decades of institutional development within the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and related federal agencies. This doctrine represented accumulated experience from thousands of warrant service operations, refined through systematic analysis of tactical successes and failures across diverse operational environments. The training framework that prepared federal agents for complex operations assumed that tactical proficiency could be developed through standardized instruction that emphasized rapid decision-making, tactical flexibility, and overwhelming force application. Dynamic entry procedures formed the cornerstone of federal tactical doctrine, based on the principle that speed and surprise provided decisive tactical advantages over armed suspects. These procedures assumed that criminal organizations, regardless of their sophistication or defensive preparations, could be overwhelmed through coordinated tactical action that denied suspects time to organize effective resistance. The doctrine presumed that tactical teams properly trained and equipped could establish immediate control over any operational environment within minutes of initial contact. Training scenarios developed by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms emphasized urban and suburban environments where suspects occupied conventional structures with standard building configurations. Tactical exercises focused on rapid building penetration, suspect neutralization, and evidence preservation within controlled timeframes. These scenarios assumed that tactical objectives could be achieved through predetermined action sequences that agents could execute reflexively under stress. The training framework contained explicit assumptions about the relationship between tactical preparation and operational success. Federal agents received extensive instruction in weapons handling, close quarters combat, building clearance procedures, and team coordination. This training assumed that technical proficiency would translate directly into tactical effectiveness when applied to real-world operations. The system presumed that agents properly trained could adapt standard procedures to accommodate variations in suspect behavior and environmental conditions. However, The training doctrine contained systematic blind spots regarding operations against ideologically motivated communities, with extensive defensive preparations and commitment to prolonged resistance. Standard tactical scenarios assumed that suspects would either surrender immediately when confronted with overwhelming force or offer resistance that could be overcome through superior tactical execution. The training framework provided no mechanisms for processing scenarios where initial tactical contact might catalyze extended confrontation rather than immediate resolution. The institutional culture within federal law enforcement agencies emphasized operational success measured through rapid case resolution and minimal resource expenditure. This culture created systematic pressures for tactical solutions that achieved objectives within compressed timeframes, avoiding prolonged operations that required extensive resource allocation and generated public attention. The performance evaluation systems that governed agent career advancement rewarded successful warrant execution while penalizing operations that exceeded planned parameters. These institutional incentives shaped tactical planning in ways that prioritized rapid resolution over tactical flexibility. Operations planners faced systematic pressure to develop tactical approaches that promised quick success with minimal risk of extended engagement. The planning framework assumed that appropriate tactical preparation would prevent operations from exceeding manageable timeframes, allowing agencies to maintain operational tempo without resource strain. The institutional culture contained embedded assumptions about the appropriate relationship between federal law enforcement agencies and civilian communities. Federal agents operated with confidence that their legal authorities justified whatever tactical actions proved necessary for warrant execution. The training framework emphasized federal supremacy over local considerations when criminal activity reached federal thresholds, assuming that communities would recognize federal authority as legitimate even when opposing specific enforcement actions. This cultural framework had been validated through countless successful operations where federal intervention achieved objectives without sustained community resistance. The system assumed that tactical superiority would translate into community compliance, preventing localized opposition from escalating into prolonged confrontation. Federal agencies operated according to precedents where initial tactical success established federal control that could be maintained through continued presence and legal process. Yet the institutional culture contained no mechanisms for questioning fundamental assumptions about community response when federal intervention challenged core community beliefs and organizational structures. The training framework presumed that communities subject to federal action would respond according to conventional patterns, even when those communities operated according to ideological principles that explicitly rejected federal authority as illegitimate. The human factors engineering embedded within federal tactical doctrine assumed that agents could process complex information accurately under high-stress conditions while executing predetermined tactical sequences. Training programs included extensive stress conditioning designed to maintain agent performance when operating under combat conditions. This conditioning assumed that agents properly trained could maintain tactical effectiveness while processing multiple information streams and adapting to changing operational conditions. The doctrine contained explicit assumptions about agent decision-making capabilities under stress. Training emphasized rapid threat assessment and appropriate response selection from predetermined tactical options. The system presumed that agents could distinguish between legitimate threats and civilian non-combatants while maintaining tactical effectiveness in complex operational environments. However, the human factors framework contained systematic vulnerabilities regarding information processing when operational conditions exceeded training parameters. Standard tactical scenarios provided agents with clear threat identification criteria and predetermined response options. The training framework assumed that real-world operations would present threats that could be categorized according to established patterns, enabling agents to apply trained responses effectively. The doctrine presumed that agent training could prepare federal personnel for operational stress without adequately addressing scenarios where initial tactical assumptions proved incorrect. The human factors framework assumed that agents could adapt tactical approaches when confronted with unexpected conditions while maintaining operational effectiveness. This assumption had never been tested against scenarios where fundamental tactical premises proved invalid, requiring agents to improvise solutions without institutional support. The equipment systems that supported federal tactical operations represented significant technological investments designed to provide tactical advantages over potential adversaries. Federal agencies had access to specialized weapons, communications equipment, protective gear, and surveillance capabilities that exceeded civilian law enforcement standards. This equipment was designed according to specifications that assumed tactical superiority could be maintained through technological advantages that criminals could not match. The equipment framework contained embedded assumptions about the operational environments where tactical teams would deploy. Communication systems assumed reliable radio connectivity in operational areas. Weapons and protective equipment were optimized for urban and suburban environments with conventional building materials and standard structural configurations. Surveillance capabilities were designed for operations where tactical teams could establish overwatch positions and maintain visual contact with target areas. Yet the equipment framework contained systematic limitations when applied to rural compound environments with extensive defensive modifications and communication countermeasures. Standard tactical equipment assumed operational environments that provided tactical teams with mobility advantages and communication superiority. The system presumed that equipment designed for conventional operations would remain effective when deployed against unconventional adversaries with specialized defensive preparations. The tactical doctrine that governed federal law enforcement response to complex threats assumed that standard procedures could be modified to accommodate operational variations without fundamental changes to tactical logic. The training framework emphasized tactical flexibility while maintaining adherence to established principles that had proven effective across diverse operational environments. This approach assumed that tactical adaptations could preserve operational effectiveness while adjusting to specific environmental conditions. The doctrine contained explicit provisions for scaling tactical response to match assessed threat levels. Operations planners could request military support, specialized equipment, and additional personnel when operations exceeded standard law enforcement capabilities. This escalation framework assumed that increased resource allocation would provide tactical advantages sufficient to overcome enhanced defensive preparations or increased suspect resistance. However, the escalation framework contained assumptions about the relationship between tactical resources and operational success that presumed additional capabilities would translate directly into tactical advantages. The system assumed that military support integration would provide federal agencies with overwhelming tactical superiority that suspects could not match through defensive preparations or tactical innovation. The training doctrine emphasized individual agent proficiency while assuming that team coordination could be maintained through standardized communication protocols and predetermined tactical sequences. Federal tactical teams trained extensively in coordinated movement, synchronized action, and mutual support under combat conditions. This training assumed that team effectiveness would remain constant regardless of operational duration or environmental stress. The team coordination framework presumed that tactical units could maintain effectiveness throughout extended operations without degradation in individual performance or team cohesion. The doctrine assumed that tactical teams properly trained and equipped could sustain operational effectiveness indefinitely when provided with appropriate logistical support and command guidance. Yet the coordination framework contained no mechanisms for addressing scenarios where extended operations created stress levels that exceeded training parameters. The system assumed that tactical teams could adapt to operational changes while maintaining predetermined performance standards, even when operations extended far beyond planned timeframes and required tactical approaches that deviated from established doctrine. The interface design between federal agencies and supporting organizations assumed that coordination could be maintained through established communication protocols and command relationships. Multi-agency operations required integration of personnel from different organizations with distinct training backgrounds, equipment systems, and operational cultures. The coordination framework presumed that these differences could be managed through clear command authority and standardized procedures. The interagency framework contained explicit assumptions about information sharing and tactical coordination that presumed compatible operational objectives across organizational boundaries. Federal agencies operated with confidence that military support organizations would provide capabilities that enhanced rather than complicated tactical operations. The system assumed that coordination challenges could be resolved through established protocols without fundamental changes to operational logic. However, the interagency framework contained systematic vulnerabilities when coordination requirements exceeded established parameters. The system presumed that supporting organizations would operate according to federal law enforcement priorities without introducing operational constraints or alternative objectives. The coordination framework assumed that tactical complexity could be managed through hierarchical command structures that maintained clear authority relationships throughout extended operations. The latent conditions embedded within federal tactical doctrine represented accumulated institutional assumptions that had been validated through successful operations but never tested against religious communities with extensive defensive preparations and ideological commitment to armed resistance. These conditions created systematic vulnerabilities that would prove incompatible with the specific challenges present at Mount Carmel, establishing prerequisites for operational failure that no amount of tactical proficiency could overcome. The tactical approach to Mount Carmel on February 28, 1993, represented the culmination of months of intelligence gathering, tactical planning, and resource allocation designed to execute federal warrants through rapid coordinated action. The operation proceeded according to established protocols that assumed tactical surprise would provide decisive advantages over the Branch Davidian community. Federal agents advanced with confidence that their training, equipment, and numerical superiority would enable swift warrant execution without extended confrontation. The initial tactical sequence unfolded exactly as planned during the first minutes of the operation. Transportation proceeded on schedule, with tactical teams approaching the compound through predetermined routes designed to maximize surprise while providing tactical flexibility. Communications functioned normally, with command elements receiving regular updates on tactical progress. Equipment operated within specifications, providing tactical teams with the capabilities they required for standard warrant execution procedures. However, the fundamental premise underlying the entire operation that tactical surprise could be achieved and maintained against the Branch Davidian community proved incorrect within minutes of initial contact. The tactical intelligence that had shaped operational planning contained systematic gaps regarding community awareness, defensive preparations, and tactical readiness that rendered standard federal approaches ineffective. According to the comprehensive investigation documented by the Government Accountability Office, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms had developed detailed intelligence on the Mount Carmel compound through months of surveillance operations, informant reports, and analysis of commercial purchases. This intelligence provided tactical planners with extensive information about building layouts, personnel numbers, weapons inventories, and daily routines that appeared sufficient for effective tactical planning. The intelligence gathering process followed established methodologies that assumed accurate information could be collected through conventional surveillance techniques. Federal agents conducted aerial reconnaissance, monitored communications, and infiltrated undercover agents into the community to gather operational intelligence. These techniques had proven effective in previous operations against criminal organizations, providing tactical planners with actionable information about suspect capabilities and intentions. Yet the intelligence framework contained systematic limitations when applied to religious communities with sophisticated counter-surveillance capabilities and extensive defensive preparations. The Branch Davidians had developed awareness of federal surveillance activities through community members with law enforcement experience and tactical knowledge. This awareness enabled the community to implement countermeasures that compromised federal intelligence gathering without detectably alerting federal agencies to the compromise. The tactical timeline developed for warrant execution assumed that federal agents could approach the compound undetected, establish tactical positions, and initiate warrant service before the community could organize effective resistance. This timeline relied on precise coordination between multiple tactical elements, with success dependent on maintaining tactical surprise throughout the initial phases of the operation. The communication logs maintained during the operation document the exact sequence of events as tactical surprise collapsed. At approximately 10:15 a.m., tactical teams reported that their approach had been observed by compound residents. Radio transmissions indicate that federal agents immediately recognized that tactical surprise had been compromised, but continued with the planned approach, based on assessment that tactical advantages remained sufficient for successful warrant execution. The tactical decision to continue the operation after discovering that Surprise had been compromised reflected institutional confidence that federal tactical superiority would prove decisive regardless of community awareness. Federal tactical doctrine emphasized overwhelming force application that could overcome defensive preparations through superior training, equipment, and coordination. The operational plan contained provisions for continuing the operation even if initial tactical advantages were reduced. However, the tactical framework contained no mechanisms for reassessing fundamental operational premises when initial assumptions proved incorrect. The system assumed that tactical modifications could preserve operational effectiveness even when key planning assumptions were invalidated. Federal commanders operated with confidence that their training and experience provided adequate flexibility for adapting to unexpected operational conditions. The first direct contact between federal agents and Branch Davidian community members occurred at approximately 10:20 a.m., when tactical teams approached the main compound building. The documentation reveals that this contact proceeded initially according to established warrant service protocols, with federal agents identifying themselves and announcing their legal authority to search the premises. The community response to federal announcement of warrant authority reflected fundamental disagreements about the legitimacy of federal jurisdiction over religious community activities. Branch Davidian representatives questioned the legal basis for federal intervention while expressing willingness to cooperate with properly constituted legal processes. This response indicated that the community distinguished between legitimate governmental authority and what they perceived as persecution of religious activities. The tactical framework assumed that federal legal authority would be recognized as legitimate by community members even when they disagreed with specific enforcement actions. Federal agents operated with confidence that proper warrant execution procedures would establish legal compliance regardless of community objections. The system presumed that tactical authority could enforce legal compliance when voluntary cooperation proved insufficient. Yet the interaction between federal agents and community representatives revealed systematic incompatibilities between federal expectations and community understanding of appropriate governmental authority. The community operated according to religious principles that required careful evaluation of governmental claims against theological standards. This evaluation process could not be abbreviated through tactical pressure without fundamentally violating community organizational principles. The escalation from verbal exchange to armed confrontation occurred within minutes of initial contact, but the precise sequence of events that precipitated gunfire remains disputed in the available documentation. Radio communications from tactical teams indicate that shots were fired from multiple locations simultaneously, creating immediate tactical confusion about threat sources and appropriate responses. The tactical response to initial gunfire followed established protocols that assumed federal agents could establish fire superiority through superior training and equipment. Tactical teams immediately sought cover while returning fire according to established rules of engagement. Communications protocols functioned effectively, providing command elements with real-time information about tactical conditions and casualty reports. However, the tactical situation that developed exceeded the parameters for which federal tactical doctrine had been designed. The compound provided defenders with prepared positions that negated federal tactical advantages while limiting federal options for maneuver and fire superiority. The defensive preparations that the community had implemented exploited systematic vulnerabilities in federal tactical approaches. The compound's structural modifications represented years of construction activity that had transformed the buildings into defensive positions optimized for resisting tactical assault. These modifications included reinforced walls, prepared firing positions, and communication systems that enabled coordinated defensive response. The defensive preparations reflected sophisticated understanding of federal tactical doctrine and systematic efforts to neutralize federal tactical advantages. Federal tactical teams found their standard approaches ineffective against defensive positions that had been, specifically, designed to counter federal tactical capabilities. The equipment and techniques that had proven successful in urban and suburban environments provided minimal advantages when applied against fortified positions with prepared fields of fire and reinforced construction. The tactical stalemate that developed within the first hour of the operation reflected fundamental incompatibilities between federal tactical doctrine and the defensive preparations that the community had implemented. Federal tactical teams lacked the specialized equipment and techniques required for reducing fortified positions, while the defensive positions prevented federal agents from applying their training advantages effectively. Radio communications during the first 4 hours of the operation document the systematic failure of standard federal tactical approaches. Tactical commanders requested additional resources while attempting to adapt standard procedures to compound conditions. These requests reflected recognition that the operation had exceeded planned parameters while maintaining confidence that appropriate resource allocation would restore tactical effectiveness. The casualty reports transmitted during the initial engagement indicated that both federal agents and community members had sustained serious injuries within minutes of first contact. These casualties created immediate tactical complications that required medical evacuation while tactical engagement continued. The tactical framework provided procedures for casualty evacuation under fire, but these procedures assumed tactical conditions that permitted secure evacuation routes. The compound's defensive configuration prevented federal tactical teams from establishing secure evacuation routes without exposing personnel to continued fire. The tactical situation required improvised solutions that exceeded standard procedural guidance while maintaining tactical engagement against prepared defensive positions. These requirements created tactical complexity that federal training had not adequately addressed. The transition from dynamic warrant execution to extended tactical engagement occurred gradually, as federal commanders recognized that standard approaches could not achieve tactical objectives within acceptable timeframes. Radio communications indicate that tactical commanders initially expected to establish tactical control within hours while gradually acknowledging that extended operations might prove necessary. The tactical framework contained provisions for extended operations, but these provisions assumed that tactical advantages would accumulate over time as additional resources arrived and defensive capabilities degraded. The system presumed that tactical pressure could be maintained while negotiations proceeded, enabling resolution through either tactical action or negotiated surrender. Yet the tactical situation at Mount Carmel proved resistant to standard escalation approaches. The defensive preparations enabled the community to maintain tactical effectiveness, while federal options remained limited by operational constraints and legal considerations. The tactical framework provided no mechanisms for addressing scenarios where tactical superiority could not be converted into tactical control. The communication systems that connected tactical elements with command authorities functioned effectively throughout the initial engagement, providing accurate information about tactical conditions while maintaining coordination between multiple agencies. Command elements received real-time updates on tactical progress, casualty status, and resource requirements that enabled informed decision-making about operational modifications. However, the communication framework transmitted accurate information that supported tactical assessments based on incorrect operational assumptions. The system provided command authorities with detailed tactical intelligence while failing to convey the fundamental incompatibility between federal tactical approaches and compound defensive preparations. Command decisions reflected logical analysis of tactical information that could not address systematic operational limitations. The initiating events of February 28, 1993, established tactical conditions that federal doctrine had not anticipated and could not address through standard approaches. The collision between federal tactical confidence and compound defensive preparations created operational dynamics that no amount of tactical proficiency could resolve within acceptable parameters. The system performed exactly as designed while producing tactical results that contradicted fundamental operational objectives. The physical transformation of the Mount Carmel compound into a defensive position represented years of systematic construction activity that fundamentally altered the tactical environment federal agents expected to encounter. This transformation reflected sophisticated understanding of federal law enforcement capabilities combined with deliberate efforts to neutralize tactical advantages that federal agencies typically enjoyed over criminal organizations. The defensive preparations implemented by the branch Davidian community exploited systematic vulnerabilities in federal tactical doctrine while creating operational conditions that standard law enforcement approaches could not address effectively. The compound's structural modifications began years before federal agents initiated surveillance activities, indicating long-term community planning for potential confrontation with governmental authorities. These modifications included reinforced walls, prepared firing positions, communication systems, and supply storage areas designed to support extended defensive operations. The construction activity reflected detailed knowledge of federal tactical capabilities and systematic efforts to create defensive advantages that could offset federal numerical and equipment superiority. According to the physical evidence analysis documented in the Government Accountability Office investigation, the compound buildings had been extensively modified from their original agricultural and residential configurations. These modifications included concrete reinforcement, steel plating, and structural changes that provided defensive capabilities while maintaining the external appearance of conventional religious community facilities. The main compound building incorporated defensive features that rendered standard federal tactical approaches ineffective. External walls had been reinforced with materials that provided protection against standard law enforcement weapons while creating firing positions that offered defensive advantages to community members. These modifications reflected systematic analysis of federal tactical doctrine and deliberate efforts to neutralize tactical techniques that federal agencies typically employed. The building's internal configuration had been modified to support coordinated defensive response while complicating federal tactical movement. Hallways and room configurations provided defensive positions with interlocking fields of fire while limiting federal options for tactical advancement. These modifications created tactical complexity that exceeded federal training parameters while providing defensive advantages to personnel familiar with the building layout. The compound's communication systems enabled coordinated defensive response while maintaining contact with external entities throughout tactical engagement. These systems included redundant communication capabilities that could function despite federal efforts to isolate the compound electronically. The communication infrastructure reflected understanding of federal tactical doctrine while providing capabilities that standard law enforcement countermeasures could not effectively suppress. The defensive preparations extended beyond structural modifications to include strategic resource allocation that enabled extended resistance to federal tactical pressure. The community had accumulated supplies sufficient to support compound residents throughout prolonged operations while maintaining defensive capabilities. This logistical preparation reflected long-term planning for scenarios where governmental authorities might attempt to force community compliance through tactical pressure. The weapons inventory maintained by the community provided defensive capabilities that exceeded federal tactical planning assumptions. The community possessed legal firearms with characteristics that enabled effective defensive engagement while operating within complex regulatory requirements. These weapons reflected understanding of federal firearms regulations combined with deliberate efforts to maximize defensive capabilities within legal constraints. The tactical engagement that developed after initial contact revealed systematic incompatibilities between federal tactical approaches and compound defensive preparations. Federal tactical teams found their standard movement techniques ineffective against prepared defensive positions, while their weapons provided minimal advantages against reinforced structural modifications. The tactical framework that had proven effective in urban and suburban environments provided inadequate capabilities for operations against fortified positions. The compound's defensive configuration created tactical problems that federal training had not adequately addressed. Standard federal tactical doctrine emphasized rapid building penetration, followed by systematic clearance of internal spaces. This approach assumed conventional building construction that provided federal agents with mobility advantages and tactical flexibility that could overcome defensive resistance through superior training and coordination. However, the compound's structural modifications prevented federal agents from achieving tactical penetration while exposing them to coordinated defensive fire from prepared positions. The defensive preparations created tactical conditions that negated federal training advantages while providing community members with tactical superiority in defensive engagement. Federal tactical teams lacked the specialized equipment and techniques required for reducing fortified positions under combat conditions. The tactical stalemate that developed reflected fundamental incompatibilities between federal capabilities and compound defensive requirements. Federal tactical doctrine assumed that tactical superiority could be established through appropriate resource allocation and tactical execution. The compound's defensive preparations invalidated this assumption by creating tactical conditions where federal advantages could not be applied effectively. The casualty patterns that emerged during tactical engagement confirmed the tactical effectiveness of compound defensive preparations. Community members operating from prepared positions achieved tactical results that exceeded federal tactical planning assumptions, while federal agents struggled to apply their training effectively under compound conditions. These patterns indicated systematic tactical advantages that defensive preparations provided to personnel familiar with compound layout and defensive procedures. The medical evacuation requirements created during tactical engagement revealed additional tactical complications that federal planning had not adequately addressed. Federal tactical doctrine provided procedures for casualty evacuation under fire, but these procedures assumed tactical conditions that permitted secure evacuation routes. The compound's defensive configuration prevented federal tactical teams from establishing secure evacuation corridors without exposing additional personnel to defensive fire. The tactical communications monitoring available to federal command elements provided detailed information about tactical conditions while failing to convey the systematic nature of tactical limitations that federal teams encountered. Radio transmissions accurately reported immediate tactical situations, while command elements struggled to develop tactical solutions for problems that exceeded standard procedural guidance. Federal tactical commanders requested additional resources and specialized equipment as the tactical situation clarified, but these requests reflected continuing confidence that appropriate resource allocation could restore tactical effectiveness. The tactical framework assumed that tactical problems could be resolved through escalated resource deployment rather than fundamental changes to tactical approach. The tactical assessment process that federal commanders employed during extended engagement followed established analytical frameworks that assumed tactical problems could be categorized according to known patterns with solutions available through standard tactical doctrine. This assessment process provided systematic analysis of immediate tactical conditions while failing to address the fundamental incompatibility between federal tactical approaches and compound defensive preparations. The tactical timeline that developed during the first day of engagement reflected systematic efforts by federal commanders to apply established tactical doctrine to operational conditions that exceeded doctrinal parameters. Tactical plans were modified repeatedly as standard approaches proved ineffective, but these modifications remained within tactical frameworks that could not address the systematic nature of federal tactical limitations. The compound's defensive effectiveness resulted from systematic integration of structural modifications, weapons capabilities, personnel training, and logistical preparation that created defensive advantages exceeding federal tactical planning assumptions. These advantages reflected years of preparation specifically designed to neutralize federal tactical capabilities while providing community members with tactical superiority in defensive engagement. The tactical equipment available to federal agents proved inadequate for operations against prepared defensive positions with reinforced construction and coordinated defensive response. Standard law enforcement weapons provided minimal effectiveness against structural modifications, while federal protective equipment offered insufficient protection against defensive capabilities that community members possessed. The tactical techniques that federal agents attempted to employ reflected training optimized for conventional operational environments with predictable tactical variables and standard building configurations. These techniques assumed tactical conditions that permitted federal agents to apply training advantages through superior coordination and equipment, while maintaining tactical initiative throughout engagement. Yet the compound environment created tactical conditions that prevented federal agents from applying their training effectively while providing defensive advantages to community members operating from prepared positions. The tactical framework that federal agents had mastered through extensive training proved systematically inadequate for compound operations against prepared defensive positions. The escalation of federal tactical response during extended engagement reflected institutional confidence that tactical problems could be resolved through appropriate resource allocation and tactical modification. Additional tactical teams, specialized equipment, and military support were requested based on assessment that enhanced capabilities would provide tactical advantages sufficient for achieving operational objectives. However, the tactical escalation process operated according to assumptions about the relationship between tactical resources and operational effectiveness that proved invalid under compound conditions. Enhanced federal capabilities could not address the systematic nature of tactical limitations that compound defensive preparations created. The defensive advantages available to community members could not be overcome through tactical escalation within acceptable operational parameters. The tactical analysis conducted by federal agencies during extended engagement focused on immediate tactical problems while failing to address the fundamental incompatibility between federal tactical doctrine and compound defensive requirements. This analysis provided detailed assessment of tactical conditions while maintaining confidence that tactical solutions could be developed through appropriate resource allocation and procedural modification. The compound's defensive effectiveness represented systematic exploitation of vulnerabilities in federal tactical doctrine that had never been tested against fortified positions with prepared defensive capabilities. The community's defensive preparations reflected sophisticated understanding of federal tactical limitations, combined with deliberate efforts to create tactical conditions that federal approaches could not address effectively. The tactical failure that developed at Mount Carmel resulted from systematic incompatibilities between federal tactical capabilities and compound defensive requirements that no amount of tactical proficiency or resource allocation could overcome within acceptable operational parameters. The defensive preparations implemented by the community created tactical conditions that exceeded federal doctrinal capabilities while providing defensive advantages that standard law enforcement approaches could not neutralize. The transformation from dynamic tactical engagement to extended siege operations represented a fundamental shift in operational logic that federal agencies had not anticipated when planning the Mount Carmel warrant execution. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's assumption of operational control from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms on March 1, 1993, initiated a prolonged standoff that would test federal capabilities in ways that standard tactical doctrine had not addressed. This transition revealed systematic limitations in federal operational frameworks when applied to scenarios where tactical superiority could not be converted into immediate tactical control. The hostage rescue team operational procedures that governed FBI siege management represented the most sophisticated federal capabilities for extended tactical engagement with barricaded suspects. These procedures had been developed through decades of operational experience with hostage situations, barricaded gunmen, and complex criminal organizations that required extended tactical response. The hostage rescue team framework assumed that tactical pressure combined with negotiation could achieve resolution through either voluntary surrender or tactical intervention under controlled conditions. However, the operational situation at Mount Carmel exceeded the parameters for which hostage rescue team procedures had been designed. Standard siege management assumed that tactical isolation would create pressure for resolution while degrading suspect capabilities over time. The compound's defensive preparations and logistical stockpiles enabled the branch Davidian community to maintain operational effectiveness throughout extended siege conditions, negating key assumptions underlying federal siege doctrine. The command structure modifications required for extended operations created organizational complexity that federal agencies had not fully anticipated. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms maintained legal authority for warrant execution, while the Federal Bureau of Investigation assumed tactical command for siege operations. Military support elements continued providing capabilities under established agreements while coordinating with multiple federal command authorities, operating according to different organizational priorities and operational timelines. The interagency coordination framework assumed that organizational boundaries could be managed through clear command relationships and standardized communication procedures. Extended operations created coordination requirements that exceeded these standard frameworks while maintaining operational pressure that prevented systematic reorganization of command relationships. The result was operational complexity that challenged federal coordination capabilities without providing mechanisms for fundamental structural adjustment. According to the comprehensive analysis provided in the Government Accountability Office investigation, federal agencies allocated significant resources to maintain siege operations while attempting to develop tactical solutions for operational problems that exceeded standard doctrinal guidance. Military support included specialized equipment, logistical capabilities, and technical expertise that enhanced federal operational capacity while operating within legal constraints that limited military involvement in civilian law enforcement operations. The resource allocation decisions made during extended siege operations reflected institutional confidence that appropriate federal capabilities could achieve operational objectives through sustained tactical pressure combined with negotiation initiatives. Federal agencies committed personnel, equipment, and financial resources to maintain operational effectiveness while pursuing multiple approaches to resolution that assumed tactical advantages would eventually prove decisive. Yet the resource allocation framework contained assumptions about the relationship between operational investment and tactical effectiveness that proved invalid under compound conditions. Enhanced federal capabilities could not address the fundamental incompatibility between federal operational objectives and compound defensive capabilities. The community's preparation for extended resistance negated federal advantages while creating operational costs that exceeded planned parameters. The tactical equipment deployment during siege operations included armored vehicles, surveillance systems, communication countermeasures, and specialized weapons designed to provide federal tactical advantages over barricaded suspects. This equipment represented significant technological investments that assumed tactical superiority could be maintained through equipment advantages that suspects could not match through defensive preparations or tactical innovation. The combat engineering vehicles provided by military support offered federal tactical teams with capabilities for breaching fortified positions while providing protection against defensive weapons. These vehicles were designed for tactical operations where armored protection enabled tactical maneuver against prepared defensive positions. The deployment of such equipment reflected federal assessment that compound defensive preparations required enhanced tactical capabilities for successful resolution. However, the tactical employment of armored vehicles created operational dynamics that exceeded the parameters for which federal tactical doctrine had been designed. The vehicles provided tactical capabilities while creating psychological pressure that could influence community response in unpredictable ways. The tactical framework assumed that enhanced capabilities would provide tactical advantages without creating operational complications that could compromise federal objectives. The surveillance systems deployed during siege operations provided federal agencies with detailed intelligence about compound conditions, while maintaining continuous monitoring of community activities. These systems included thermal imaging, audio monitoring, and visual surveillance that enabled federal tactical planners to assess compound conditions and community response to tactical pressure. The intelligence gathered through extended surveillance operations provided federal agencies with unprecedented insight into compound operations, while revealing the community's capability for sustained resistance under siege conditions. This intelligence confirmed that compound defensive preparations enabled effective resistance while community cohesion remained intact despite extended tactical pressure and isolation. Yet the surveillance framework operated according to assumptions about the relationship between intelligence gathering and tactical effectiveness that proved inadequate for compound conditions. Enhanced intelligence could not provide tactical solutions for operational problems that exceeded federal doctrinal capabilities. The information gathered through surveillance confirmed tactical limitations rather than providing pathways for tactical resolution. The negotiation initiatives undertaken during extended siege operations represented systematic federal efforts to achieve resolution through communication rather than tactical action. FBI negotiators employed established techniques for engaging with barricaded suspects while attempting to develop communication relationships that could facilitate voluntary surrender. These techniques assume that sustained communication could identify resolution pathways that avoided tactical confrontation. The negotiation framework contained explicit assumptions about the relationship between tactical pressure and negotiation effectiveness that presumed tactical advantages would enhance federal negotiation position while creating pressure for community compromise. Federal negotiators operated with confidence that tactical superiority combined with isolation would create conditions favorable to negotiated resolution. However, the negotiation process revealed fundamental incompatibilities between federal operational objectives and community organizational principles that could not be resolved through communication alone. The community operated according to religious beliefs that required careful theological evaluation of governmental demands, while federal negotiators operated according to legal frameworks that assumed governmental authority could override religious objections through appropriate tactical pressure. The psychological operations employed during siege operations included sleep deprivation, noise harassment, and communication isolation designed to create pressure for surrender while degrading community defensive capabilities. These techniques represented established federal capabilities for influencing barricaded suspect behavior while maintaining tactical pressure that could facilitate resolution through surrender or tactical intervention. The psychological pressure framework assumed that sustained tactical and psychological pressure would create conditions that favored federal resolution objectives while degrading community resistance capabilities. Federal agencies operated with confidence that appropriate pressure application would achieve resolution within acceptable timeframes while maintaining tactical advantages that could support alternative resolution approaches. Yet, the psychological operations revealed additional incompatibilities between federal capabilities and community characteristics that exceeded federal planning assumptions. The community's religious cohesion and ideological commitment to resistance provided resilience against psychological pressure, while federal techniques created additional operational complications without achieving tactical advantages. The tactical planning for potential intervention during siege operations included detailed assessment of compound defensive capabilities combined with development of tactical approaches that could achieve federal objectives through coordinated assault. These plans represented sophisticated tactical analysis that incorporated intelligence gathered during extended surveillance while addressing defensive preparations that had proven effective against initial federal tactical attempts. The intervention planning framework assumed that enhanced tactical capabilities combined with detailed intelligence could overcome compound defensive advantages through appropriate tactical execution. Federal tactical planners operated with confidence that proper resource allocation and tactical coordination could achieve objectives that initial tactical attempts had failed to accomplish. However, the intervention planning process operated according to tactical assumptions that compound defensive preparations had already proven invalid. Enhanced federal capabilities could not address systematic incompatibilities between federal tactical approaches and compound defensive requirements. The tactical planning framework could not develop solutions for operational problems that exceeded federal doctrinal capabilities regardless of resource allocation or tactical sophistication. The decision-making process that governed federal operations during extended siege reflected institutional pressure for resolution combined with recognition that standard approaches had proven inadequate for compound conditions. Federal commanders faced systematic pressure to achieve operational objectives while operating within legal and political constraints that limited available tactical options. The decision-making framework contained explicit assumptions about the relationship between operational duration and tactical effectiveness that presumed extended operations would create conditions favorable to federal resolution objectives. Federal agencies operated according to precedents where sustained tactical pressure achieved resolution through suspect surrender or successful tactical intervention under controlled conditions. Yet the decision-making process operated according to institutional logic that could not address the fundamental incompatibilities between federal operational capabilities and compound defensive requirements. Extended operations created operational costs and political pressure without providing tactical solutions for problems that exceeded federal doctrinal parameters. The secondary crises that developed during extended siege operations included medical emergencies, supply shortages, equipment failures, and coordination problems that created additional operational complexity, while maintaining tactical pressure against compound defensive positions. These secondary challenges reflected the systematic strain that extended operations created for federal agencies operating beyond planned operational parameters. The crisis management framework assumed that federal agencies could maintain operational effectiveness during extended operations while addressing secondary problems through established procedures and additional resource allocation. Federal agencies operated with confidence that appropriate resource management could maintain operational effectiveness while pursuing primary objectives through multiple tactical and negotiation approaches. However, the secondary crises revealed systematic limitations in federal capabilities for sustained operations under tactical conditions that exceeded doctrinal parameters. The accumulation of operational stress created systematic degradation in federal effectiveness while compound defensive capabilities remained intact throughout extended engagement. The stabilization attempts undertaken by federal agencies during the 51-day siege represented systematic efforts to achieve operational objectives through enhanced capabilities, sustained pressure, and negotiation initiatives. These attempts reflected institutional confidence that appropriate resource allocation and tactical persistence could overcome compound defensive advantages while achieving federal objectives within acceptable operational parameters. Yet the stabilization process revealed fundamental incompatibilities between federal operational frameworks and compound defensive requirements that could not be resolved through resource enhancement or tactical modification. The compound's defensive preparations and community cohesion created operational conditions that exceeded federal capabilities regardless of tactical sophistication or resource allocation, establishing prerequisites for operational failure that no amount of tactical persistence could overcome. The systematic investigation conducted by federal agencies following the conclusion of the Mount Carmel siege revealed the comprehensive scope of operational failure that had occurred despite adherence to established protocols and commitment of substantial federal resources. The Government Accountability Office analysis, congressional investigations, and internal agency reviews documented systematic incompatibilities between federal operational capabilities and the specific requirements that religious community confrontations presented. These investigations established that operational failure resulted from embedded assumptions within federal tactical doctrine, rather than individual tactical errors or inadequate resource allocation. The forensic analysis conducted by the Treasury Department's Administrative Review Group provided detailed examination of Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms decision-making throughout the investigation and warrant execution phases. This analysis documented how federal agencies operated according to established investigative and tactical frameworks while encountering operational conditions that exceeded the parameters for which these frameworks had been designed. The review confirmed that federal personnel acted within their training and authority while producing outcomes that contradicted fundamental federal law enforcement objectives. The post-incident documentation revealed that federal agencies possessed accurate intelligence about compound defensive preparations and community commitment to resistance. Yet this intelligence was processed through analytical frameworks that could not accommodate scenarios where tactical superiority would prove insufficient for operational success. The intelligence assessment process operated according to threat categorization matrices that assumed criminal organizations would respond to federal intervention according to predictable patterns established through decades of law enforcement experience. The investigative findings documented systematic failures in federal risk assessment methodologies when applied to religious communities with extensive defensive preparations and ideological commitment to armed resistance. Standard risk assessment assumed that appropriate tactical preparation could overcome defensive capabilities through superior federal training and equipment. These assessments could not process scenarios where defensive preparation specifically designed to counter federal tactical advantages would prove systematically effective. The congressional investigation conducted by the House Committees on Government Reform and Oversight and on the Judiciary provided comprehensive analysis of federal decision-making throughout the Mount Carmel operation. This investigation documented how multiple federal agencies coordinated according to established interagency frameworks while producing operational results that none of the participating agencies had anticipated or planned to achieve. The congressional findings established that federal operational failure resulted from systematic incompatibilities between federal capabilities and compound requirements, rather than failures in individual performance or resource allocation. Federal personnel executed their training effectively while operating within legal and procedural constraints that prevented adaptation to operational conditions that exceeded federal doctrinal parameters. The legal analysis conducted following the siege examined the relationship between federal legal authorities and tactical capabilities when applied to religious communities operating according to principles that explicitly rejected federal jurisdiction as illegitimate. Federal agencies possessed clear legal authority for warrant execution while lacking tactical capabilities adequate for achieving legal objectives against prepared defensive positions. The legal framework that governed federal operations assumed that legal authority could be enforced through tactical capabilities when voluntary compliance proved insufficient. This framework had been validated through countless successful operations where federal legal authority combined with tactical superiority achieved compliance without extended confrontation. The Mount Carmel operation revealed systematic limitations in this framework when applied to communities prepared for prolonged resistance based on religious principles. The cost-benefit analysis conducted by federal agencies following the siege documented expenditures exceeding $1 million for military assistance alone, with total operational costs far exceeding normal parameters for warrant execution operations. These costs reflected the systematic resource requirements that extended siege operations created while failing to achieve tactical objectives that justified the resource allocation. The financial analysis revealed systematic inadequacies in federal cost estimation frameworks when applied to operations against prepared defensive positions with community commitment to extended resistance. Standard cost-benefit calculations assume that appropriate resource allocation would achieve tactical objectives within predictable timeframes, preventing operations from exceeding manageable financial parameters. The personnel performance analysis conducted by federal agencies documented individual and unit performance that met or exceeded established standards, while producing collective operational results that contradicted federal objectives. Federal tactical teams executed their training effectively while operating under tactical conditions that prevented standard approaches from achieving intended results. The performance analysis established that operational failure could not be attributed to inadequate individual performance or unit coordination. Federal personnel operated according to established procedures, while encountering tactical conditions that exceeded the parameters for which their training and equipment had been designed. Individual competence could not compensate for systematic incompatibilities between federal capabilities and operational requirements. The equipment effectiveness analysis documented systematic limitations in federal tactical equipment when deployed against fortified positions with prepared defensive capabilities. Standard federal equipment provided adequate capabilities for conventional law enforcement operations, while proving insufficient for operations against defensive preparations specifically designed to counter federal tactical advantages. The equipment analysis revealed fundamental assumptions about the relationship between tactical equipment and operational effectiveness that proved invalid under compound conditions. Enhanced equipment could not overcome systematic tactical disadvantages that defensive preparations created when federal approaches remained constrained by operational parameters designed for conventional environments. The training assessment conducted following the siege examined federal tactical doctrine and training methodologies that had prepared personnel for standard law enforcement operations while providing inadequate preparation for extended siege operations against fortified positions. Federal training emphasized rapid resolution and tactical flexibility while assuming operational environments that permitted federal advantages to be applied effectively. The training analysis documented systematic gaps between federal training scenarios and compound operational requirements that no amount of tactical proficiency could overcome. Training optimized for conventional environments could not provide personnel with capabilities required for operations against defensive preparations that specifically countered federal tactical doctrine. The interagency coordination analysis examined federal frameworks for managing complex operations involving multiple agencies with different organizational cultures, operational priorities, and legal authorities. These frameworks functioned effectively within established parameters while proving inadequate for operations that exceeded normal coordination requirements and extended operational timelines. The coordination analysis revealed systematic limitations in federal organizational structures when applied to operations requiring sustained coordination under tactical conditions that exceeded normal operational parameters. Enhanced coordination could not address fundamental incompatibilities between federal capabilities and operational requirements that exceeded organizational adaptation capabilities. The Intelligence Assessment Review documented systematic limitations in federal intelligence gathering and analysis methodologies when applied to religious communities with sophisticated counter-surveillance capabilities and ideological commitment to operational security. Federal intelligence gathering techniques provided extensive information while failing to assess the effectiveness of community defensive preparations against federal tactical capabilities. The intelligence analysis revealed systematic assumptions about the relationship between intelligence gathering and operational planning that proved inadequate for compound conditions. Enhanced intelligence could not provide tactical solutions for operational problems that exceeded federal doctrinal capabilities, regardless of intelligence accuracy or comprehensiveness. The Tactical Doctrine Review conducted by federal agencies examined standard law enforcement approaches and training methodologies that had proven effective across diverse operational environments, while proving systematically inadequate for compound operations against prepared defensive positions. Federal tactical doctrine emphasized rapid resolution and tactical superiority, while assuming operational conditions that permitted federal advantages to be applied decisively. The doctrine analysis documented fundamental assumptions about criminal organization capabilities and community response patterns that compound operations had proven invalid. Standard tactical approaches could not address defensive preparations that specifically exploited federal tactical vulnerabilities while providing community members with systematic defensive advantages. The regulatory modification process initiated following the siege included revisions to federal operational procedures, interagency coordination protocols, and tactical doctrine designed to address systematic limitations that compound operations had revealed. These modifications represented comprehensive federal efforts to enhance capabilities while operating within legal and political constraints that limited fundamental changes to federal operational approaches. The regulatory analysis revealed systematic institutional resistance to acknowledging that certain operational scenarios exceeded federal capabilities regardless of resource allocation or tactical sophistication. Regulatory modifications focused on procedural enhancement rather than recognition that some operational requirements exceeded federal institutional capabilities within acceptable political and legal parameters. The long-term institutional impact analysis examined changes in federal law enforcement culture and operational approaches following the Mount Carmel siege. Federal agencies implemented training modifications, equipment enhancements, and procedural changes designed to improve operational effectiveness while maintaining confidence that enhanced capabilities could overcome tactical challenges that previous approaches had failed to address. The institutional analysis documented systematic federal commitment to tactical solutions for operational problems that had proven resistant to tactical approaches. Enhanced federal capabilities could not address fundamental incompatibilities between federal operational frameworks and specific operational requirements that exceeded federal doctrinal parameters. The systemic lessons analysis revealed that federal operational failure at Mount Carmel resulted from accumulated assumptions about federal capabilities, criminal organization responses, and tactical effectiveness that had never been tested against religious communities with extensive defensive preparations and ideological commitment to armed resistance. These assumptions created operational frameworks that proved systematically inadequate for compound operations regardless of resource allocation, tactical proficiency, or operational persistence. The comprehensive forensic evidence established that federal operational systems functioned exactly as designed while producing outcomes that contradicted fundamental federal law enforcement objectives. The system failure resulted from embedded design assumptions rather than operational execution errors, revealing systematic limitations in federal capabilities that no amount of tactical enhancement could overcome within acceptable operational parameters.